So at this point, I turn from my spiel to the real business of the morning, and that is our speaker, Bernadette. She's a PhD candidate in creative writing at the University of Liverpool, and we are very proud of her. Her short story, For the Man Who Died in the Wood, was shortlisted for the UK's biggest unpublished writing prize, the Manchester Fiction Prize, in 2020. She has delivered a number of creative writing projects for the university, including a course for the Great Read competition and Writing for Wellbeing for key workers across the UK during the first lockdown. And Bernadette's going to be telling us a little bit more about that. She works through the University of Liverpool's Department of English, and I'm sure she'd be the first to acknowledge the support of her colleagues in this work. She won the Liverpool Guild Award for the biggest impact on the City of Liverpool for her creative writing workshops. So I think you can begin to see why we are indeed very proud to claim Bernadette as one of our own. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to you, Bernadette.
Thank you, Diana. That was a fantastic introduction. And it's so lovely to see you all here today and everybody at home as well. I think it's great we've got the session live so everyone can be included. First of all, I thought we'd just talk about some of the projects I've led and some of the other people who've written stories as a product of that, rather than going straight into my writing, because I'm really proud of those people. As some of you may be aware, the last few years we've had a few projects tied into sort of supporting people through the pandemic, and one of those was a Writing for Wellbeing project. And basically, just before the pandemic hit, I was doing some in-person work with the Playhouse and Merseycare for people who needed writing for wellbeing, and those groups are going really, really well. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and they all stopped. And I was quite worried about those people because they were getting a lot out of it. And I said to Sam Solnick, one of my supervisors, wouldn't it be good if we could put a course online somehow for people to have different creative writing prompts, and they could choose to write poetry or prose, just to give people something to kind of, keep focused and help them process their feelings without writing about it directly, which some people aren't very good at doing. So we set up Writing for Wellbeing, and the way we did it was with pre-recorded videos, because we also set out this programme to offer it to NHS trusts across the whole of the country. We had over 100 people sign up, so it's quite a lot of people, and obviously they all work different shifts, and couldn't just say meet on a Wednesday at 5 o'clock on Teams and we'll all do it. So on a Monday we would send out a video with the video pre-recorded and a worksheet. So what we're going to do now is just play one of those videos so you can see an example of what we did. Every week had a different topic, and we had one week that was called Reimagining Hope.
Hi everybody, I hope you're doing really well. Welcome back to Writing for Wellbeing, now week 3. Last week we were thinking about vulnerability, and this week we'll be thinking about hope and how we can use our imaginations to try and reimagine this new future we're facing. Some have said the COVID-19 crisis feels surreal, as if they were trapped in some dystopian novel or film, or in a dream from which they hope to wake. Holding on to hope during these difficult times is crucial. The etymology of the word hope stems from the late Old English hoper, meaning confidence in the future. At a time when the future is hard to picture, how can we use our imagination to create hope in our minds, hearts and actions? Warm up. Let us think about how lockdown has affected us so far. There are many issues, from missing family and friends to managing illness and death. Some people have been able to use this time to reevaluate many aspects of their lives, from their consumer habits to work-life balance. Others have had to adapt to living without friends or relations. Quickly, jot down something positive that might come out of the experience or even the trauma of COVID-19. This could be a change in your life or behaviour, a newfound appreciation of what you value, or a broader social change.
Stop that there. It's a 3-minute video, just to give you an idea of the things that we were sending out to people. So, you know, you could be, it was open to staff and students and the general public really, and people just came across it and signed up, and or you could be a doctor finishing a shift on a Sunday night and get that in your inbox on a Monday morning. And that's one of the examples of the little sort of warm-up tasks we had, and you have like 2 main creative writing exercises. But when I was recording these videos in my apartment at the time, I was quite near to like an ambulance route. So sometimes I'd have to like stop the slide and do it again because of the ambulances in the background, because this was during the first lockdown. So I was thinking, you know, this is really quite serious, and you know, there could be like that paramedic could be in the ambulance, could be doing this course. And just looking back at this video now, you know, it makes me a little bit emotional, because it was, you know, a really, you know, serious time. People were really badly affected, and the book that I'm going to be signing after this is called A Spray of Hope, and that's like an anthology of all the sort of, you know, poetry and prose that came out of that, and some of it was short fiction too. But we never planned to have this book. It was just simply, let's do a course, let's put it online. A few people might sign up, and maybe like 3 or 4 ended up being 100. But in the end, when it got towards the end of the course after the first lockdown, I said again to Sam Solnick, my supervisor, you know, it's such a shame just to leave all these, you know, pieces of writing in my inbox, because every week people would email it into me and get some feedback, and I give them feedback on the work and stuff, and ask how they were and have a bit of a chat. And I said, is there any way we could get some kind of funding to, you know, make an anthology of the work and, you know, put it into something as a memory, because really it's like a time capsule of, you know, of what happened during 100 years from now. People will look back, and, you know, there's beautiful poems, and there's one by a nurse called Richard Skelhorn, where he's written that one to, that poem towards the end of the first lockdown, and he's got like a line about faded rainbow pictures and windows, and now the pictures are starting to fade and stuff. So there's stuff in there written during the first few weeks of it, and stuff at the end as well. But just to say, everyone's here to, you know, probably think about writing short fiction or getting started with writing for the first time. These people had never written before. They worked in very non-creative jobs, and they're all brilliant. So, so yes, I think it's a lovely example. And then more recently, we've had the Great Read competition, the Changing Natures anthology. That was a 4-part series of creative writing workshop that I led for December, January, February, and March. And it was all online, so it was a live one. It's a little bit different, and we had people in real time. But it sounds weird to say this, because I'm sure everyone's done hundreds of Teams meetings, and it's very flat and hard going. But there was like an atmosphere through the computer on these sessions. Maybe a few people here came to them, I don't know, but I give people exercises again, and people were so brave in sharing the work and shared really great stuff. And we've had a couple of students. I think, is it Saul is here? Yeah, didn't you win the postgraduate category for the Changing Natures? And one of my undergraduates won the undergraduate category as well, Kaya. So it's just so brilliant to see people sort of engaging in creative writing and getting started, and then submitting it somewhere, and then seeing it in print. So it's a big journey. But for my, I think we've got some pictures as well, actually, of the Spray of Hope anthology in a bookshop. So you can see it's here on the main table amongst all the other big books that were out that time. And it's a big achievement for all those people who just sort of sign up to a course thinking, oh, I'll see what that's about, maybe give me a bit of distraction, or it might be fun. And then the next thing, you know, 3 months later, the work's printed, it's in a bookshop, the family and friends are going to buy it. And another nice thing was that all the profits went to NHS charities in the area. So that was really nice too. Yeah. Good. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to tell you a story about a story. So after I finished the Writing for Wellbeing course, I hadn't written anything myself creatively for quite a while, because I was doing homeschooling for this one and a 4-year-old, and the house was upside down, and there's like dishes everywhere, and it was a total mess. And my supervisor, quite rightly, Darren Reese Jones, was emailing me saying, have you got any stories? Have you written any stories? And I was like, maybe there's one somewhere, I'll have a look. And then I just looked on my fridge, and this is on my fridge, and It's a picture of my little boy at nursery, and his nursery used to send like picture collages to me of him doing different things. And this was at a forest school in a place called the Blackwood in Liverpool in Walton. I'm not sure anyone's familiar with that place. And I just thought, well, sometimes if you're stuck for someone to write, you can just find a bit of text somewhere and just start off with that sentence. So I decided to use the sentence here because it was quite striking, like learn to make marks using hammers. You know, it's trying to describe something quite innocent, but it's also a bit of a kind of violence in there too. You know, you learn to make a mark in the world using a hammer. You know, so I thought I'll start off with that sentence. That was my initial idea to get writing again. And I thought, you know, I can always erase it later. You know, just getting going kind of thing. And then, long story short, I wrote that story. It's a story that got shortlisted for the Manchester Fiction Prize last year, and it's being published in an anthology of climate fiction in November as well, called Sunburnt Saints. So I just thought I'd read the first 2 pages from that story, so you can see how that evolved from being quite harassed, looking at the fridge and writing a story. So I've got up my laptop because the book isn't out till next year, but here we go. So it's called For the Man Who Died in the Wood. Learn to make marks using hammers. The sentence runs through a thin paper photo collage displayed on a fridge. Not the one where the body was taken. It's a tall silver economy fridge belonging to the mother of the little boy who had learnt to make many marks for his friends in the wood. The woman can't see the memory as the fluorescent yellow border around the words makes the letters go pop. Tree falls, man falls, and after the storm they never went back. The mother wonders about the dog who waited by the man's side. The gates on all 4 corners of the wood stay locked, and the entrance pathways become overgrown. Nature flourished and perished. Habitats for birds undisturbed, a call to a wood dead but for their own kind, and the squirrels and the things that crawl beneath. The singing became louder as the days blurred. Winter turned to spring. Passers-by trailed the streets around the perimeters of the wood, pressing their ears to its coal black railings, which lined its borders. Some half inclined to jump over to hear more, but they daren't. Food scarce. Nothing dropped, littered or left, even out of kindness. Muddied warning signs or entry points forbidding any human, good, bad, or in between, to come in. Someone from the government holds the key and comes by once or twice to check for danger. Again, leaves. The mother opens the fridge to get some milk, and 3 happy faces jump at her from the collage. That was the last time the birds saw the children. Jumping off logs in high-vis vests, paid for engagement with nature. Escaping the city's fumes on the nursery bus. Dimpled hands clasped together, holding s'mores over a fire. Barely warm hot cocoa dripping down their mouths, running a rivulet over their chins and down their soft necks. The note on the wood gate simply says, there is no time or date given for the site to reopen. But what does that mean? Perhaps it will be left untouched, like some shrine. But unlike a bedroom with dust gathering and all the stillness that offers sameness, life will carry on. A fungus will grow in trees. Creatures will find a way to feed or leave. New birds will come. Some things though will be unmoved. A lost red Wellington boot, tree branches gathered and bent over in a child's prayer for protection, fashioned into a triangle roof. And what if the storm whose passage across Europe was at the beginning of all this, Chiara, the Irish feminine version of Chiara meaning black, a little black one. Funny how the gale was so drawn to a wood going by the name of Blackwood, as doted magnets of darkness, unable to resist the pull of the other, and then snap, still. A fridge magnet holds up hope on a piece of paper. So I'll just leave that there. I won't read the whole thing out, but
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette.
That's okay.
A huge amount for us to talk about in what we've touched on there. But I want to start by asking you about, as it were, short form writing. I mean, some of the contributions to A Spray of Hope, which I do recommend. It's a wonderful anthology, I think, take the form of poetry. But much of it is the short story, short fiction. And you've been thinking about that. And you talked too about the Great Read competition, which was specifically for short stories.
Yeah.
I think people do sometimes talk about fiction as if it's all one thing. But the short story is different, it has a very particular power, which I think you're extremely aware of, and it has a history of exercising that power on its readers. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where you think the power of the short story specifically derives, what it can do that the long-form novel can't do.
I think you can think about short fiction and like photography. For example, I teach creative writing and prose, and on the first week of teaching, I brought in a short story by Matteo Calvino called The Adventure of a Photographer, and he's talking about the sort of biophotography, and if we photograph every single thing we see, then it's like it never existed. Do we have to do that? But I think short fiction is kind of like, you've got a camera and it's a different sort of ranges you can pull in, and the wide range and again, and I just think for example, my PhD research is around climate change feelings and how it's represented in fiction, and that's very hard to do in a novel. Obviously, we've had a lot of what we call it cli-fi, climate fiction, but I think climate change, in my opinion, is about people. It's not about climate change. It's the people we need to paint in the stories to show like why things are going wrong, why we're not kind of reacting to things. So my short story collection that I'm working on for my PhD, which will hopefully be finished and out next year, has very many different people in it, and different, not just people. One story is in first person water flee. Basically, I wrote a short story based on the Daphnia magna trial that they're doing in the biology department at Nest Gardens, where they're warming up water fleas to see how a species might adapt to climate change. So I reached out to the scientists and went to the labs and met the water fleas. And we were stood there, me and these two scientists, and I was like, so how do you think a water flea might think? Like, well, they can't think, but they could think. So they're on the slide and they've got like one beady like compound eye. So like they're probably looking at the light thinking this really bright light's on my one beady compound eye type thing. And then I just got to know the water fleas. That sounds a bit strange, but I did get to know them, and I wrote a story as if I was a water flea and I was being heated up, and they faint between 6 to 12 times before they die. Their heart rate goes to 200 beats per minute. So I thought I'll put a monologue in the story with no punctuation to simulate the effect of the heart rate going quite high, and so that was quite interesting, trying to think about different forms. And obviously, if that had been a novel, I wouldn't be able to do stuff like that and play around with things like that. And the short story, the form that allows you to do those kind of different things, particularly in a collection, but even just as a standalone story, you can do something, be a bit more adventurous, I think.
Yeah, it gives room for experiment. I think that's right. Different perspectives, the water flea among them. Yeah. Interesting that you mentioned Calvino, and that there's a pantheon of writers who publish exclusively in that mode. Contemporary writers and writers within the history of the medium. I'm thinking of Catherine Mansfield, for instance. There are others, Lydia Davis, Alice Munro. Who would you single out alongside perhaps Calvino as writers within that subgenre that you have learned from or admire, and who you might recommend to the audience to turn to learn from, because we all learn from what's already there.
I mean, I'm quite a big fan of people who've got the skill to use quite pared down prose but leave people hanging on with emotion on the end of a sentence. I don't really like really flowery, kind of like quite sickly sweet kind of prose and stuff like that. So I think like Lydia Davis is a brilliant example of that. You've got her story, Break It Down, which I was familiar with. That was a really good one. And some of her short stories is like half a page and stuff. So you don't need this big like poetic backdrop to a story. It's about I don't know how she does it. She just kind of it's like an impressionist type thing. She just leaves it the bare details down and the light comes in, and she's just absolutely amazing. But I think in terms of like more recent writers, there's a writer called Lauren Groff who has written a collection called Florida, and all the stories are either set in Florida or they're about a character linked to Florida. And again, it is to do with sort of climate change and environmental grief, and it's just a really weird thing with each short story. She just, rather than sort of saying, giving you sort of, an implied ending, she just tells you the ending, like, then it was too late and it's all over now kind of thing. You can kind of left there going, whoop.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of, that is what it will be like. So she's just basically showing you how it will, but up to that point, it's all very kind of like, there's nice images and it's all, kind of, you're left to. So she's been a big influence on me.
Could you spell the name so that I can follow it up?
Yeah, Lauren Groff. Lauren Groff.
So G-R-O...
F. Yeah.
Take a note, folks.
And she had a novel out. She had a novel out just before that, and it was chosen as Barack Obama's novel of the year too. I think it's called Fast and Furious, something like that. But yeah, she's a really good writer. And all her short stories are sort of set around, it's about climate change, but it's it's about the family. So one short story, a family's going trick or treating, and then there's like a sinkhole outside the house. And it's all about the divorce, but it's actually tied in around it rather than being like this, one big event and one hero comes along to overcome it all. It's about the small kind of things that happen in life that will build up to this bigger picture.
So I've done in my time quite a bit of research on Victorian literature, and there's a great tradition of short stories in Victorian literature. But one of the things that has always impressed me about Victorian short stories, and I think this is connected to what you're talking about, is the way that Victorian novelists use the short story for experiment. And quite often you will find that a writer, say like George Eliot, who's a model, if you like, for the power of realism, will provide you with a short form fiction like The Lifted Veil early in her career, that engages with the supernatural. Or Thomas Hardy, for instance, again, very realist novelist. His short stories are ghost stories. Elizabeth Gaskell, again, writing within domestic realism, is the most extraordinary short story writer, and many of her short stories are ghost stories. There's a very powerful tradition of the short story and the supernatural. And I think that those 19th century writers were often asking us to think again about nature by taking us out of nature into the supernatural. And I think there's a real connection there with what you were talking about, moving our perceptions into a kind of a different arena, something that it comments on nature, but will manipulate the boundaries of nature. Not necessarily ghost stories, though I think that tradition's not dead, the short story and the ghost story. But you're talking about something different. Is that, you think, a kind of persistent feature of the short story, how you can use it to push things in a way that, as you say, it's harder in a novel. You do it in a short story.
Yeah, I think you can really kind of, stir people's feelings a bit more with a short story, in my opinion. I suppose like with a novel, you might get to know a character over a longer length of time, maybe, and build relationships to them. And some people, they love sort of trilogies and things for that reason. But I think a short story can be more powerful. You can see, a more deeper perspective of somebody or of a situation in a short story. And I love what you were saying about, the short story traditionally, like, in supernatural, and I would love to do something like that as one story in my collection. Haven't got around to it yet, but I do plan to.
And the stories you mentioned the Great Read, and the Great Read anthology. I mean, there's a brilliant example of what I'm talking about there with Elizabeth Bowen, The Demon Love, which is, in some ways, it's a scary ghost story, but in other ways, she's talking about other issues, and about a calamity comparable in some, though not all ways, with climate change, and that is the Second World War. And the destruction that has brought. And she's pushing that into her short story. The undergraduate prize winner in that anthology, which I do recommend to you, it's well worth reading, is Sami Ali, a medical student. And his story, a cadaver's response to
the great title,
it is a supernatural story. So you can see those writers manipulating that model But thinking again about that tradition of the short story, that there was, thinking of people's reading habits, there was a period from about 1875, probably up to the Second World War, where most people were literate.
Yeah.
You know, first generation perhaps of almost universal literacy. There wasn't the internet or television.
No.
There was cinema, that was a different thing. So people were reading a lot of journals and magazines, and they were full of short stories. And it was possible then for a writer to make a living out of providing those magazines with short stories. And when things changed, that tradition rather faded and shrank. So it was much harder to find outlets for short fiction. But my feeling is, and I think the pandemic's got a lot to do with this, there's been a real revival. People maybe have, less time in their lives to read chunky novels, or perhaps thinking in terms of trying creative writing for themselves. Just so much more interest in the short story than has previously been the case. That appetite seems to be coming back. Is it your impression that the short story, and maybe alongside poetry, though that's a different kind of writing, the short story is back?
Yeah, I really do think so. And I think maybe it's something to do with like attention span during the pandemic, whereas people didn't maybe have the mental capacity to read something very big.
Yes,
But it just, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it just seemed to be this big kind of appetite for short fiction. And obviously, in the Northwest, we've got like the Edge Hill Short Story Prize that's been going for a number of years. But I do think there's more and more people who are just coming out as solely short fiction writers, whereas the past you have to be like a novelist to get an agent, get a book deal, then you can do a short story collection. Like Sarah Hall would be a good example for that. But now there's more agents. If you look on the list and stuff, like saying we do accept just short story collections, whereas a few years ago that was unheard of. You couldn't. You'd be lucky to have a short story collection and just get a deal for it. You have to prove yourself in some other way first by having like a novel or something like that. So I'm hopeful. But another thing with short fiction is it's good in a way, because if you've got a novel, you have to write the whole novel, and then if you publish it anywhere else in an extract, then it goes against you in terms of getting an agent or a book deal. But with the short stories, if you've got a short story shortlisted somewhere like me, or you've had it published, it actually looks good to get a deal. You can approach an agent and say, I've got this collection, I've had one short story published here or a couple here, then and actually you can get your work out there as well and build a following. Yes. So it's actually, probably a good thing I chose that for my PhD rather than a novel.
I think that's right. I think it was a good decision. Yeah. And I think it is tied in with something you were talking about in your introduction. That is, and it's associated with the pandemic, though I suspect it predates the pandemic to some extent. And that is a need for creativity. People are really beginning to sense that, because our lives, our cultural lives, are so passive. That we watch the television, we watch Netflix, we listen to recorded music. We're so passive. And a short story, alongside other sorts of creativity, I think it's akin to cooking and gardening. But of course, this is a creativity. It takes the form of words. And I think the pandemic then really accelerated that. If the university had announced a prize for a first novel, we would not have had many entries.
No.
But thinking about a short story is something that almost anyone can do. So I think it is, leaving aside the pandemic or even climate change for a moment, I think it's a symptom of a real need, young people perhaps especially, but not just young people, to find, as it were, a model for making something that is feasible, that is possible, that is rewarding, and that you can grow through. Is that your feeling?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And also there's been like a few examples where we've had like short
Yeah.
stories have been adapted into like series from Netflix.
Yes.
There's like Love, Sex and Robots,
Yes.
and thought that was really good.
Yeah,
And there's like
true.
a few short story writers, and then make it into
Yeah.
like so it's like more, sort of cross-cultural engagement.
Yeah.
Obviously you've got like typical, sort of Radio 4 short
Yeah.
stories, things like that. I do think more people wanted to sort of, interact with the medium of a short story in different ways. And, for example, I was thinking about a friend of mine's a playwright. Maybe we could collaborate to turn a short story into a play and see what different things you can do with it.
That's a good point. It does overlap, doesn't
it
with,
can
with
overlap.
other cultural forms.
And it's easier to adapt in a way, obviously depending on the story, than like a novel. To adapt a novel would have to be like a TV series, or it'd have to be like a film. Whereas a short story can speak to so many different kind of themes, and just
gives you more scope.
It gives you more scope.
But even for people who are not necessarily thinking, and not everybody is, certainly as they start out, of publication or developing it into a kind of professional activity, there are real rewards and benefits in writing. Writing short fiction, say poetry falls into that heading. I don't just mean writing as therapy. I mean that finding within writing a way of defining and creating a shape for your thoughts and your life. It's genuinely supportive, even if your only reader is your mum. I still think that it is creative and rewarding. So just to be practical, because we are, as you know, practical people, Bernadette.
Yes.
So if there's anyone in our audience, or perhaps watching online or our recording afterwards, thinking, well, maybe I can have a crack. I'm not going to be the next Alice Munro anytime soon, but can you give us any immediate tips? You sit there, you've decided you're going to have a go. Here I am, blank paper, pen, or maybe blank screen, fingers, keyboard. Where do you start? How do you actually make that rather daunting first step to, I've written a story. Look at that, it's a story. How do you get there?
Well, it's a really interesting point. And I think the hardest thing about writing a story or writing anything is getting started, isn't it? Let's face it, you think you've got to write something, whether it's a report, whether it's a conference paper, or or insurance thing or fiction, you've got to start with the first thing, and it seems so overwhelming. The blank page is so overwhelming. And I was actually going to ask people to do something today, and I know it's not a workshop, as I'm used to doing workshops all the time, but I'd like people to go away, and the people at home as well, you can do this at home, and just think of 3 words. It could be something you see around you, or something that just pops into your head, and just keep a note of it, or write it on your phone or on your pad that you've got with you, and do that, and just and try and follow it up when you get home later in the day, or even a sentence, or just 3 words. Another thing you can do as well, and I often do this exercise with my students in other workshops that I do, is choose an object. So Virginia Woolf's very good at this, like creating a story through objects. The famous dinner scene where she's like talking about the tensions between a relationship through the cutlery and how it moves around. Choose an object, for example, this bottle of water, and just start writing something about it. You could even try and draw it first, like an artist making a study of something, and then often that gives way to like a story. So we did this last week in one of my classes, and someone wrote about some jewelry. Somebody wrote about a watch, and had an incredible story just from someone choosing a watch, and this idea of life going on, and while the second hand is ticking, and the news, and but they can't hear it, and it's just doing something simple like that can really help people get started. Just choosing something to focus on, almost like mindfulness in a way. But that can actually bring a story out.
Or it perhaps could be a story that you've read, but in a sense that's too daunting, isn't it? To think of a group of words, just 3 words.
Just 3 simple words, I
think that's I'm hoping that as we're speaking, people are either making a mental or maybe even a physical note, the 3 words that you might choose to trigger a story.
And just be like quite intuitive as well, like don't overthink it. I always say, like, just let the words choose you. It sounds a bit like kind of
Yeah.
cheesy, but like just what comes to you kind of thing. And I think when you start writing as well, you can't be like too precious. You have to like just get that, you know, into the flow of it, because if you stop every other sentence to analyze
Yeah.
things, you won't get kind of going with it.
I think that's a really good point. One of our speakers in the festival, I don't know whether you were able to hear it, Bernadette, Andy Osho.
No, I never got to hear this one though.
So she was very funny about the process of writing her first novel. And she said, and this is an experience that I think we can all recognise, and I'm sure you will recognise it, Bernadette, that she was absolutely determined that the writing was going to be perfect. So she would brood for hours over a sentence and produce a page after weeks and weeks of cogitation. And so much work had gone in to her preliminary writing that she then couldn't bear to change it because of all the time and labour and mental sweat that she's expended on the first draft, and how that then turned into a real barrier, because when it became clear that she needed to throw most of it away, and that would be as true for a shapely short story as a full-length novel, it was a matter of too much anguish because of what she had invested in it. So her practical advice was, don't do that. Don't look for perfection as your fingers hit the keyboard. You can try, no one achieves perfection, but you can try to get closer to what you wanted from your writing in going back and looking at it and reshaping and redrafting those initial ideas. And the important thing really in that first draft is just to get it down on paper.
Definitely. I think, and my little girl, she's here as well, Rosie, she's a good example that children are like really uninhibited, so they just write without worrying about what other people think of it. And I think we need to think like children sometimes and just get going and, you know, and just, you know, try and forget how, you know, you might perceive it later or somebody else might perceive it, and just do it and get into the real flow of it, and and then just go back. I mean, I can't talk, sometimes I do that as well. I'll like end up editing as I go along, and but you know, I think one of the biggest things is once you've got a draft down, you might go back, and it's sometimes like tenses, you might change the tense, stuff like that. But you can do that later.
Or really fundamental things, which you can also do later, as to who's telling the story, whose voice is it. Or again, referring to what other people have been talking about, because you know these events do make a kind of pattern. And one of your colleagues in the Department of English, Danny O'Connor,
Danny,
you know, who has just published his very brilliant first novel, which again I recommend to you, Nothing, and it is an extraordinary piece of work, said something I think really interesting, which probably does apply to the short story, that it's a mistake to think it's your plot or your characters or your dialogue that's the starting point. His view was the real starting point is the tone. That the tone of your writing, once you have, as it were, established that imaginatively, will then provide the starting point for what the story will do and where it will take you. I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think tone and the feeling is something that comes across. And to give an example, we've had a few international students who've done the creative writing modules before, and sometimes there's been a bit of a struggle with language, but the feeling of the story still carries the story. Even though that has given a bit of help and feedback and some structural stuff, but even without the language making complete sort of translating to straight English, the feeling carried it through, and the tone was there. So someone's got a really distinctive writing voice. That's what carries the story.
That's right.
And me and Danny had this discussion. I was like, well, you know, it's really the story's really good. You know, it's the feelings there, and it's just like really distinctive voice and how they've done that, and
that's right. And that can be as distinctive and individual as a fingerprint.
Really.
And it runs right through the story.
That's what I say when people sometimes compare, like
Yeah.
doing like a workshop and someone will say, someone will read something really beautiful and then the next person will go, oh, I can't follow up after that kind of thing. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, everyone's writing is so individual. It's like a fingerprint.
That's
And I always give that example. It's never going to be the same. You wouldn't want it to be, really.
No,
So,
because it's a very flexible one. It's every bit as flexible as poetry from that point of view, you know, as distinctive. So there are some really practical tips there. I do like the one of taking 3 words.
Yeah,
I can see how that really would be a good starting point, or thinking about an object.
Yeah, it does help.
But I do want to be sure that we're leaving plenty of time, Bernadette, for others, including our online participants, because I know that we have some, so don't be slow to send questions if you are watching online. But I want now to hand over to you, sitting on your blue chairs, to put your questions to Bernadette. Don't forget just to wait for the mic, and I see that the bearer of the mic is standing up, all in readiness. So, questions, thoughts, comments for Bernadette.
Hello.
Hi.
I've been pondering what you two were discussing about Lydia Davis, because that was one of the main sources I looked to when I was trying to write for The Great Read. And this is more of a question to anybody who's read her work, whether it's something, the way she manages to do what she does is about distilling all hosts of emotions and associations down to something like a single object, you know, in half a page, managing to make you walk away from the page, and then maybe a day later what you're remembering is, you know, a particular object or a gesture or a glance from one character to another, and then that final phrase that she concludes her stories with. There's something about stripping the mechanics of the story down to such constituent parts of object and the communication that object has with the people in it. It's more of a comment, really, but no. I'd like to know what you think.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I'm such a fan of hers, and I wish I knew how she does what she does, because I'd try and copy it all completely, but she's got a lot of experience, and you know, all her stories have that quality about them, I think. And I think it's like interesting you've got saying, that's what I was trying to say about trying to write an object, because obviously we hear this kind of like, you know, comments from lecturers all the time, like, you know, show don't tell when it comes to like short story writing or any kind of writing. And it's quite hard for people to do, because sometimes they think, I just want to tell what happened, and just, but it's so much better when people show it. Obviously Lydia Davis does that for the objects and stuff. So it's just trying to, like, you know, create a feeling, or create even like sometimes like an anticipation that something's going to happen through the way, you know, a glass could be like moved in some kind of sinister way, or you know, she just does it in a certain, I don't know, it's so hard to sort of pinpoint exactly how she does it. But
she's just so economical, isn't she?
Yeah.
I mean, she doesn't waste a word. I remember a friend of mine saying, having looked at my own pieces of very inept writing, and said something which I've always remembered, and certainly, you know, be true of Lydia Davis and other great short story writers. Remember, she said, every single word needs to earn its living.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, because you just haven't got time. Well, you haven't in the novel, really, but certainly in the short story, you haven't got the space for passengers.
Yeah, I really like that.
If the word isn't there working and earning its living, it's got no role in what the story's doing. So you mustn't, and this is where I fall down, you mustn't give in to the temptation to leave a sentence or a paragraph in just because you're kind of in love with it. Because if it's not really moving the story forward, It's got to go into that file called little bits of writing that I love but can't use.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want to be like Lydia Davis, I think people often, it's like painting again, people will over fill it in at first, you'll have, and then they'll end up taking bits out, because you're trying to learn the story yourself when you're first writing it. You don't know where the story's going to go, it just evolves as you're doing it. And then you go back, it's almost like having an eraser and going, okay, we don't need 3 sentences to show that I just meant this one kind of thing. And then you start trying to do that stylistically, being like economical with the words and using the barest amount of language to display or evoke a really powerful feeling. And it's a talent that comes with time, and
it's a discipline.
To do.
It is. Discipline and experience, perhaps, rather more than talent in the end. Other questions? Yes, here at the front.
I just wondered how you could recommend, for me, I work in nature quite a lot, and I'm very inspired by nature, and obviously I know that you are as well, but I find when I start writing, it's a bit very factual, because obviously I have bees, and I know what goes on in the hive and how the process happens. So when I start writing, it just becomes very factual, and I really struggle to capture the creative side of it. And I just wondered if you could recommend how I can overcome that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And people might be surprised, but actually a lot of my writing is very logical, and I use a lot of sort of scientific research, and that's what I kind of get down first. So, example, you're talking about beekeeping, and there's certain ways that the hives might work and stuff. I think you should write the factual stuff down first of all, and then you've got the idea there, and then start adding the flourishes to it, and trying to make say you've got almost like a prose poem, so you could write down 10 lines about beekeeping or the way that the bees behave, and then you could maybe add another sentence in between, try and write something creative, start padding it out a little bit. For example, the scene in the story, but you didn't get to the second part of the story, but there's a part in the Man Who Died in the Wood where the woman turns into Storm Kiara, and she flies around Europe visiting different places, so she changes form. And to write that bit, I had to actually research, where did Storm Kiara go to? How did it progress? Where did it go? And then I turn that into the story. For example, because of that storm, it was the fastest flight time from New York to Heathrow. So I said in the one line, in any form, she never thought she'd become a world record breaker. So it's a woman, but it's like a storm. So it's you'd have to add on. It's a good thing to. I think it's a good thing to get the facts down kind of first and work from that. And a lot of time with anything that involves something, it's not scientific, is it really? But people, you have to try and avoid doing the information dump.
Yes.
So you'll be writing something, and you'll know it. Why things need to be written in a certain way. If somebody was a beekeeper, they might recognise certain things. But if other people that are reading it, the lay readers, it's kind of just a feeling that you're kind of creating. And sometimes people just need to. I always say there's no such thing as bad writing. There's only sort of writing that people can't let go of. Sometimes you just let go a bit with writing. They're doing it too cautiously, kind of thing.
So it's a really interesting question, because I think another thing that gets in the way sometimes, and maybe this is partly what you're up against, is a sort of sense of duty. So all sorts of interesting stuff about bees, and there's a bit of your mind that's thinking, these people out there, they know nothing about bees, they're so interesting. So you can't resist smuggling it in, because you want people to learn from your short story about bees and how to look after them and how important they are and the domestic life of the bee and so forth. But that's not what the story's doing. That's what you're saying, isn't it? You can't make it an instruction manual.
But it's hard if you're not if you don't not done it before, or you think you can't be creative. But another thing you can do as well is try playing around the narrative voice.
Yes.
You could try and write a first person bee, for example, pretend you are the bee, just to try and open up the perspectives, and sometimes you can do that with a main sort of character, just to try and see the different kind of use as a different people or forms in the story, or just try reading some fiction around bees and poetry. And
I don't know whether you know it, but there's a great short story by Rudyard Kipling about a beehive in the voices of two bees talking to each other.
is it a kid story?
It's called The Wax Moth. Yeah, it's just so unexpected from Kipling. And again, could only have been done in the short story form. And he's thinking about why bees behave as they do. But I mean, it's very funny, actually. It's a very funny story. But it's so unexpected. And just, again, it's a great example of what the story can do for readers. It's years since I read that story, but actually I remember it really vividly. The two bees are called Melissa, which means kind of honey, and Saccharissa, which means very sweet.
Oh, wow. That's really good.
Further questions? Yes.
I was wondering, given that you write on climate change, whether you were drawn to your subject by like the desire or maybe a feeling of responsibility to convey a message to your readers about like an important topic that we should all care about, or whether it's your inspiration in a more abstract sense.
That's a good question, thank you. I first became drawn to the topic when I finished my undergraduate degree, which I did at Liverpool. So I've been here for 8 years. They just literally can't get rid of me. I've been here since my access course. And then I did a Master of Research in Creative Writing, and I was the first person to do that, because not many people know that you can do it. And I chose to do a novel. So I wrote a novel about a seaweed scientist who leaves England after the referendum. He's not very happy about the result, and he goes to live on an Irish island cultivating seaweed. And it was all kind of to do with the environmental effects of doing that. Like, if farming seaweed, it affects the natural habitats and ecosystems. So all the sort of local Irish people who lived on the island were against him. So he was trying to do some good, like make a stand, but he ended up working with this really evil American corporation trying to like take over all the. But in the end, I decided to leave that novel and go and do a short story collection, because I thought, with it being sort of Brexit based, it might get a bit dated.
Yeah.
But it was quite interesting. It was comedy as well, so it made my supervisors laugh. But yeah, and then I came to the collection, and I just was really struck by the way sort of climate change communicated and how people engage with it. And a lot of sort of traditional sort of sci-fi has always been like quite dystopian, end of the world narratives. People can't really always relate to them in the here and now kind of thing. Like, well, this is like 100 years from now, and I can't imagine it being like The Walking Dead. And so I just thought we could have more sort of fiction that's, you know, set in not just the here and now, or maybe like the near future, but just that has characters in there that are, you know, sort of normal people, you know, families or students, or you know, just people do like everyday things. So a lot of my stories are just, you know, about everyday lives. We've got the water fleas, and to be fair, that story was about their everyday lives. Yeah. And then being experimented on, because Daphne and Magna have been used for, you know, hundreds of years to be experimented, because they were populated in a very certain way. But some of my short stories in that collection really do focus on just, you know, sort of the simple things in life. And I think if you do that, and people can be drawn into it, and then you sort of slowly unveil this kind of, you know, bit of emotional kind of hit on them. That's what we hope to do anyway. And then they get taken in by it.
Thank you. And I notice that we have run out of time, which seems to have happened very quickly, I must say. But I do want to thank you for a really great event, so interesting and inspiring, encouraging. And that's what we need.
I hope so.
We all need encouragement.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. It's been great. So, thank you.